I was 58, the night my wife made sure everyone in the room knew I was nothing more than a burden. That word hung in the air heavier than the smell of barbecue smoke drifting from the kitchen. I sat at the end of a polished oak table surrounded by relatives and neighbors, people who had known me for decades, yet, in that moment, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Linda, my wife of 33 years, was in her element. At 55, she still commanded attention, with the kind of confidence that could fill a room. Her pearl necklace caught the light of the chandelier, and her laugh cut through every conversation. She loved evenings like this, gatherings where she could perform, where she could craft the story of our family the way she wanted it told. To her, I was no longer part of that story, not really. Our son Ryan, 30 years old, sat on her right side. He wore a tailored jacket that I knew he could not afford, his hair perfectly styled, as if he were about to step onto a stage. Ryan had been through more failed startups than I could count. Each one left behind a trail of disappointed investors and unpaid bills, but to Linda, he was still the golden boy. She clung to the fantasy that one day he would make it big, that his name would shine in the business pages of the Houston Chronicle. I had been a logistics engineer most of my life, the kind of job that never impressed anyone at a dinner table. Freight lines, schedules, supply chains, none of it made for glamorous stories. It was steady work, though, and it paid for the house, the cars, the private school tuition. When my health forced me into early retirement, Linda stopped even pretending to respect what I had done. She began to introduce me as retired with a little smirk, as if that word meant washed up. Dinner was halfway through when Linda tapped her glass with a spoon. The chatter died down, heads turned. I already knew what was coming. She leaned forward, smiling, her voice dripping with sugar. David has been retired for some time now. He spends most of his days tinkering in the garage or watching baseball reruns. A few polite laughs rolled down the table. I forced my lips into something resembling a smile, though my chest burned. Then she placed her manicured hand on Ryan's arm. But our Ryan is the true pride of this family. He is building something remarkable, something that will carry our name into the future. Ryan leaned back, smirking like he owned the air around him. I could see the spark of satisfaction in his eyes as he glanced at me, a silent victory. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. No one looked my way. Linda was not finished. She tilted her head toward me, her tone still light, but her words cutting deep. David means well, but he has always been a bit of a burden. Without Ryan, there would be little to be proud of. The room froze. For a long second, no one spoke. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner and the faint buzz of cicadas through the window. Then a cousin cleared his throat, changing the subject, but not before I caught the pity in his eyes. That was worse than the laughter. Pity felt like a nail hammered straight into my chest. I chewed my food slowly, tasting nothing. My hands trembled under the table. I thought about every holiday I had worked through, every night I had spent on the road, every moment I had chosen duty over comfort. I wanted to slam my fist down and remind them of the life I had built for them, the sacrifices I had made. Instead, I swallowed hard and stayed silent the way I always did. Ryan whispered something in Linda's ear that made her laugh out loud. She threw her head back, pearls glinting. I did not hear the words, but I did not need to. I knew they were about me, a joke at my expense, another reminder that in their eyes I had already been written off. Later, Ryan raised his glass. "Big things are coming soon," he declared. "Investors are lining up this time. Everything changes." The room erupted with applause. Linda kissed his cheek, pride radiating from her. I raised my own glass because it was expected, but the smile on my face felt brittle, ready to crack. When dessert was served, I pushed my plate away and excused myself. The patio outside was cooler, the night air thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms. I gripped the railing until my knuckles whitened, staring out at the dark yard. Inside, laughter spilled through the sliding door, Linda's voice carrying above it all. I thought about leaving, just walking to the car and driving off, letting them finish their performance without me. But I stayed rooted, bound by habit and a loyalty that felt more like chains. 33 years of marriage had trained me to endure, to shrink myself down until I fit the space they allowed me. When the evening finally ended, Linda walked out, radiant, Ryan still basking in admiration. I trailed behind them, carrying nothing but silence. The drive home was quiet. Linda scrolled on her phone, Ryan hummed some tune to himself, and I kept my eyes fixed on the road, headlights carving through the dark. I pulled into our driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a long moment before stepping out. The house loomed before me, familiar yet cold, a place where I no longer belonged. I locked the car and followed them inside. The night ended like so many others, with me invisible in the home I had built. What I did not realize then was that everything was already shifting. That night's humiliation was only the beginning, the crack in the surface that would eventually split wide open. But for now, all I carried was the sting of Linda's words echoing in my head, the weight of every stare at that table, and the hollow silence that waited for me inside my own house. I woke before the sun and stood in the kitchen, listening to the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of traffic on Westheimer. Linda came in wearing a silk robe and an expression that said she had slept just fine. I poured her a cup and said nothing. "Big week coming up," Ryan said, investors from Austin and New York, numbers trending up, everything about to pop. I watched his face as he said it. He was already thinking about how to turn Margaret's pride into leverage. Margaret Collins was 82 and sharper than anyone in the room when she chose to be. She had started Collins Freight with one leased truck and a stubborn belief that reliability could be a brand. Over decades, she grew that into a fleet that crossed Texas day and night. Then she took the profits and bought property, little pieces of Houston, that later became neighborhoods with gates and glossy brochures. She called that afternoon and asked if we would come for Sunday lunch. Inside it was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from discipline and money earned the hard way. Ryan moved around the living room, telling a story about an app that would change logistics. Margaret sat in her favorite chair and watched him with a small smile that did not give away much. She asked him how many paying customers he had and whether his books had been reviewed by a real accountant. Ryan said that in tech you had to move fast and that reports could come later. We ate food that tasted like restraint. Linda spun Ryan's story bigger and bigger until it floated like a parade balloon above the table. Margaret asked again about revenue and churn and what his burn rate looked like. Ryan laughed and said that burn was a silly word used by people who did not understand momentum. Linda added that this was finally the year the family would get the recognition it deserved. Margaret turned to me and asked how I was sleeping. I told her that some nights were better than others, and that the doctor was happy with my numbers. She asked if I still walked at Memorial Park in the mornings. I said not as often as I should. Then she asked Ryan to help his grandfather's old driver move a box from the garage to the shed. Ryan said that he had a call with a founder on the coast and disappeared down the hall. When the room was quiet, Margaret looked at me and smiled, not the polite smile she saved for parties, but the real one that lived in the lines at the corners of her eyes. She asked if I would walk with her outside. We went to the back garden where the crepe myrtles were in bloom, and the air smelled like rain on hot stone. She told me that she had watched the way people treated one another in this family for a long time. She said that her daughter liked the performance of success more than the work, and that her grandson had confused ambition with entitlement. She said that money was loud and character was quiet, and that quiet things were easy to ignore until it was too late. I did not speak. It felt like standing in church when the sermon turns and you realize the words are for you. She said that she had read one of Ryan's pitch decks and that the numbers did not smell right. She said she had asked a friend who knew venture finance to look, and that the friend used the word sloppy 3 times. She said that if Ryan had been honest about the user numbers and the revenue, she could have forgiven failure. She could never forgive someone who asked for trust while hiding the truth. I felt a twitch of shame for my own silence all the times I had let his talk go unchecked because I did not want another fight. She rested her hand on my arm and said that she had seen me patch the porch light without being asked. Drive her to her cardiology check when the summer rain flooded the street. Tip the delivery kid extra when Linda was not looking, and make sure the handyman drank water on days that felt like a furnace. She said that those things were not small to her. She said that the people who think they are small are the ones who never do them. For a moment, I could not find my voice. I wanted to tell her that I had tried to be the kind of man my own father had been, steady and reliable, a man whose handshake mattered and whose word meant something. Instead, all I could say was that I did not know how to be anything but simple. She laughed softly and said that simple was the most complicated thing for some people. She told me that she had already given instructions to her attorneys about how her affairs should be handled when the time came. She said that clarity was the best gift a person could leave. Then she turned to me and said that I was the only man in this family who made her feel at ease. I wanted to protest. I wanted to tell her that I was not perfect, that I had lost my temper behind closed doors, that sometimes I was tired of being ignored and would let dishes pile up just to see if anyone noticed. She said that she knew the difference between a man who was broken and a man who had been bent by weather and had straightened himself again. She said that I was the second kind. Ryan came back out, then talking into his phone and gesturing like a conductor. He told the heir that the term sheet would be finalized tomorrow, and that this was only the beginning. Linda returned with a glass of iced tea and asked her mother if she had heard the good news about the raise Ryan was about to secure. Margaret answered that she had heard many versions of good news in her life, and that she always waited for the version that survived a quiet room. On the way out, Margaret asked me to carry a box to the trunk of my car. It was filled with old photo albums and a few ledgers from the early years of Collins Freight. She said that if I had time, I might help her sort through them next week. I said it would be my honor. She touched my cheek the way a mother does when she knows you need more than words. As I set the box down, she leaned close and whispered that sometimes the kind thing to do for a family is to hold a line that others cannot hold. I nodded, though I was not sure I deserved that kind of trust. Back home, Linda breezed through the kitchen, replaying her favorite parts of Ryan's story for herself. Ryan stood at the island, bragging into his phone about due diligence, as if the words were a script he barely understood. I set the box in my study and opened one of the ledgers, running my fingers over Margaret's neat handwriting from decades ago. Beside the numbers, she had written little notes to herself in a tidy line, reminders to pay the driver early before the holidays, to send flowers to a dispatcher whose mother was sick, to replace a tire for a warehouse worker whose paycheck would not stretch. The book smelled like dust and cedar, and something else, the clean scent of a life built on keeping promises. I closed it gently and sat in the quiet, the house around me buzzing with Ryan's optimism and Linda's bright plans. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt less empty and more like a deep breath before a turn in the road. I did not know what was coming next, only that Margaret had seen me, and that the space she made with her words was big enough for me to stand up straight inside it. When Linda hung up, she told me that Margaret was gone. I thought of the garden path behind her house and the way she had pressed her hand to my arm and told me I made her feel at ease. The funeral was set for the following Saturday at St. Thomas Episcopal in Houston. Linda came out of the closet in a fitted black dress, diamonds at her ears, eyes rimmed with careful liner. Ryan arrived late, hair perfectly arranged, wearing a jacket that had to be new. Linda said that of course they would, and that appearances mattered today. Old colleagues from Collins Freight shook hands with bankers and city officials. We filed into the front pew with the family. I kept my hands folded and my eyes on the altar. The priest spoke about Margaret's grit and her mercy, how she could balance a ledger and still remember a birthday. He told a story about the first truck she leased and how she drove it herself when a driver called in sick. After the service, we moved to the parish hall for the reception. People used the same phrases, how sorry they were, how incredible Margaret had been, how she would be missed by the city. Each time I nodded and said thank you. Linda found a circle near the center of the room and began her second performance of the day. She told a cousin that she had already been in touch with the firm handling the estate and that everything would be handled with dignity. She said that Ryan would be stepping up, that he had a vision for the future of the family. Ryan added that his company was in late-stage conversations with investors from Austin and New York, and that capital would not be a problem once they had the right assets in place. Their words traveled quickly, the way words do when they confirm what people already want to believe. I heard a neighbor from River Oaks tell her husband that it only made sense that Linda was the daughter, and Ryan was the heir in spirit, if not on paper yet. A retired banker from Collins Freight shook his head at a friend and said that the company and the rentals and the rest would be safe in the family. Then he laughed softly and added that sons-in-law are fine for lifting boxes and pouring coffee, but not for serious matters. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I turned my body so they could not see my face. The coffee in my cup had gone lukewarm and bitter. I set it down and wiped my palms on my trouser legs. Each sentence landed like grit in a gear. I thought of the ledgers in my study with Margaret's careful notes about paying a driver early before Christmas. I thought of her hand on my cheek when she asked me to hold a line others could not hold. I thought of telling them all that Margaret had seen me. The words pressed against my teeth and would not come. Nancy Lopez crossed the room carrying 2 plates, one balanced on top of the other. She had been our neighbor for 10 years, the kind of woman who knew everyone's dog by name and brought tamales to the block party at Christmas. She smiled with the tense smile people wear at funerals and said that the turnout was beautiful. She said that Margaret was beloved. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur still loud enough to ride the hum of the room. She said that people were already talking about how the inheritance would give Ryan the boost he needed, that everyone knew it was practically his already. Then she saw me fully, and her words hung in the air between us like a bridge with a missing plank. I felt my face burn. Nancy's smile fell. She reached out as if to touch my arm and then thought better of it. I managed a small nod. My mouth felt filled with cotton. The circle around Linda grew. Ryan told the story of his latest app again, this time with more certainty. A former councilman asked about revenue, and Ryan pivoted to growth, saying that the money would follow. Linda said that her mother had always believed in vision, and that Margaret would be proud to see Ryan take the reins. One of the original drivers from Collins Freight drifted over and stood near me. His name was Earl, and he had hands like bark. He said that he remembered the winter Margaret drove overnight to San Antonio because the run could not be missed. He said that he saw me at the hospital once with her, and that I had a way of listening that made her breathe easier. He did not say anything about who should get what. He did not need to. He patted my shoulder and went back to his small group by the door. I found a quiet corner behind a potted ficus and watched the room turn like a slow wheel, aunts dabbing at their eyes with tissue, bankers comparing calendars, friends lining up for pie, Linda's laughter ringing above it all, Ryan's hands drawing shapes in the air, as if to map the future right there over a tray of dinner rolls. I told the minister that I was fine and thanked him for the service. He nodded in a way that said he knew I was not telling the whole truth. By the time the reception thinned, Linda asked Ryan if he was ready to head to the house to meet with a few people who wanted to pay respects in a more private setting. She glanced past me as if I were a lamp. Ryan said that sounded good and mentioned a call he needed to take about the term sheet. I picked up a stack of sympathy cards and tucked them into my jacket. Traffic hummed on the nearby street. A bird scolded from a crepe myrtle. Earl tipped his hat as he passed and said that Margaret had always liked straight talk. I nodded. My mouth finally remembered how to swallow. I thought of the garden again and of the sentence she had given me to carry. The world felt the same size as it had that morning, and yet something was shifting below the surface. I did not argue with anyone that day. I did not claim my place or defend my worth. I walked to the car with my hands open and my jaw tight, the red heat slowly fading from my cheeks, and the smallest ember of resolve alive enough to warm my palms. The next afternoon, the house felt staged for something I could not quite name. The blinds were half drawn, the dining table cleared of flowers and framed photos from the funeral, the surface bare except for a neat stack of papers beside a glossy black pen. Linda stood by the window with her arms crossed. Ryan sat at the head of the table with his laptop open, the blue light washing his face. He did not look up when I came in. He said there were documents that needed my signature so the estate would not get bogged down. I pulled out a chair and sat. The first page stared back at me in bold letters that read Durable Power of Attorney. Another was labeled Management Agreement. There were places for my initials on every page and a signature line at the end with a date already filled in. I ran my finger along the top sheet and asked who the power would grant authority to. Ryan said to him for day-to-day, and to Linda for household matters, that it would be easier for everyone. He said I would still be respected as family and consulted on important decisions. I told them both that the probate process would name an executor and that we should wait for the court to do its work. I read the first paragraph again. The words felt slick under my eyes. I asked who this attorney was and whether we had our own counsel to review the forms. Ryan sighed and leaned back in his chair. He said I was making a simple process difficult. He said we needed to move fast before assets got frozen. I asked for the name of even one friend who had done it this way. I pushed the pen back across the table and said I would not sign until I consulted an attorney I trusted. He leaned forward, eyes hard, hands flat on the wood. He told me I knew nothing about money. He told me to sign if I did not want to destroy myself. I said I was not refusing to help. I said I was refusing to be rushed. Linda stepped in close palm on the chair back behind my shoulder. She said a household only works when everyone knows their place. She said I had a place here as long as I cooperated. She said there were only two paths in front of me, one where I trusted my own family. I stood and carried the papers to the window where the light was better. I read the second page and found language about broad authority, about the power to transfer, sell, borrow, and direct. No limits, no defined scope, no sunsets. I asked Ryan if he had any idea what fiduciary duty meant. He said it meant not being naive, it meant doing what needed to be done. I asked if he realized that a durable power would outlast any momentary inconvenience and would give him control over accounts with my name on them. He said that was the point. Linda crossed to the other side of the table and picked up a second set of papers already clipped. She said they had prepared alternatives in case the first draft made me nervous. She said this version gave her primary authority and Ryan secondary. She said it was cleaner that way because vendors and bankers already knew her. I asked why they had versions at all, if this was just a temporary convenience. My chest tightened. My hands began to sweat. I set the pages down. I told them again I would not sign anything without counsel. Ryan stood the chair scraping the floor and smacked his palm on the table so hard the pen rolled to the edge. I swallowed it. I told him that my answer was no today and likely no tomorrow, that the court would appoint an executor and we would follow the law. He told me that the law bows to people who move first. He told me that I needed to get out of the way. Linda walked to the doorway and then back. She said I had enjoyed a comfortable life for years because she had handled the social world that I did not understand. She said this was no different. She said I only had a place in this house if I listened. I looked at her and searched her face for some hint of the woman I had married, some softness around the eyes that might argue with the words her mouth had just made. I asked what would happen if I refused again. Linda tilted her head and said that I would make things hard. She said hard things had consequences. Ryan said he would call the bank and let them know we had a family dispute and that for safety they should restrict my access until the structure was set. I told him he could not do that. He told me to watch him. I felt strength gather in a place I had nearly forgotten, the place that had carried me through long nights in freight yards and bad roads and storms that turned interstates into rivers. I took a breath that filled my chest. I said that if they made even one call to a bank on my behalf, I would document it and bring it to the court with dates and times and names. I said that if any document appeared with my signature that I had not given, I would file a police report. Ryan lifted the pen again and held it out like a challenge. He told me to think about what I was doing. He said I was choosing pride over family. I told them that unity without respect is theater. Linda stepped back as if I had pushed her. For a long moment, no one moved. The air seemed to thicken. I set the pen on the stack of papers and pushed it gently toward the center of the table. Then I stepped away from the chair. Ryan asked where I thought I was going. I said for a walk. He told me not to leave until we finished. I kept moving. Linda said that we were not done and that I could not ignore my obligations. I told her that my first obligation was to do no harm to myself at the demand of others. I reached the doorway and paused. The room behind me felt small and airless. I picked up my keys from the console and slipped on my shoes. The front door opened with a sound I knew by heart, the soft pull of a seal, the click that always followed. Heat lay over the porch like a blanket. I stepped into it and let it press against my face until my shoulders dropped. I walked down the sidewalk past the crepe myrtles and the neat lawns, past a kid shooting a basketball into a driveway, hoop past a couple walking a small dog that looked like a fox. The sky was a clear, hard blue. My feet found a rhythm that matched the drum of my pulse. I did not know where I was going, and it did not matter. Every step put more air between me and the table where I had been told to know my place. I let the sun find the back of my neck. I let my hands swing loose at my sides. When I reached the corner, I stopped and looked back once. The house sat quiet, blinds half closed, holding its secrets. I turned away and kept walking the silence of the street, cleaner than the silence I had left behind. I did not make it halfway down the block before my phone buzzed against my thigh. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen with a Houston area code. A measured voice introduced himself as Carter Wilson, branch manager at Gulfstar Bank on Kirby. Carter said he was calling about activity on accounts connected to the Collins estate. He said that two individuals had come into his branch with documents that claimed authority to act on my behalf regarding pending estate funds. His team had refused the request, and he wanted to confirm that I had not authorized anyone to represent me. I told him I had authorized no one. The paperwork did not meet the standards his bank requires, and certain details did not reconcile. In my mind, I saw Linda's tight smile and Ryan's impatient hands. The pair presented a photocopied power of attorney naming me as the principal and assigning sweeping powers for management and transfer. The middle initial was wrong. The notary seal looked like a pixelated stamp. They insisted funds needed to be moved promptly into an investment vehicle. The conversation escalated when the teller asked to retain copies for compliance review. They requested immediate access to transfer a large portion of a pending deposit associated with the probate filings. They also asked for information about existing accounts and attempted to add themselves as authorized signers. His team declined every request and created an incident report. I asked if I could come by in person. 10 minutes later, I turned toward home, grabbed my truck, and drove to the branch. Carter explained what had happened with a few more details. The pair had arrived with confidence and the urgency that often signals a script. The woman led the conversation, dropping the names of people in River Oaks and implying long relationships with the bank. The younger man attempted to take over when questions started, insisting the bank was jeopardizing a family's financial stability. When his teller requested to verify the notary by calling the number printed on the stamp, the younger man suggested that would be a waste of time and tried to redirect. He had added holds and alerts requiring in-person authentication for any changes, no exceptions. He suggested that we add a verbal password on file that would be required for any phone requests. I thought of Margaret's garden and the loose flagstone she had tapped with her cane. I said flagstone would do. Remove phone banking from the estate-related accounts entirely until probate finalized. Set withdrawal limits to 0 where legally allowed. Lock down paper statements to pick up in branch only. I told him to proceed. He asked whether I wanted to file a police report. A part of me recoiled at the idea of walking into a precinct and saying that my wife and my son had tried to steal from me. Another part remembered Ryan's palm slamming the table and Linda's voice telling me I only had a place in the house if I cooperated. I asked Carter what he would do in my position. He said that documented facts protect reasonable people. He said a report now could be referenced later if needed. I nodded. He printed the incident summary and slid it over for my signature, then added a bright yellow sticky note with the case number he would file with bank security and the Houston Police Department's non-emergency line. He told me to keep a folder with dates, times, and exact words. He told me to take screenshots of any texts and to email them to myself, so there was a timestamp independent of my phone. On the way out, he told the staff if there are any requests on the Collins estate, call him and then ask me for the password. It was a small ceremony, but it settled something in me. He said to expect escalation. People who are told no rarely stop at one attempt. I sat in my truck for a moment, palms on the wheel, feeling the shape of the next steps assemble. Call Daniel. Bring in Robert to review the financial rails. Scan the papers on my dining table and send them to a new email address built only for this mess. Ryan's name lit the screen. He wrote that I could not hide money forever. He wrote that a bank is only as stubborn as the person who knows which buttons to press. He wrote that soon I would be asking for his help on my knees. My thumb hovered over the reply field. I did not respond. I took a screenshot. Then I opened a new folder in my photos and named it with the date. I forwarded the image to my email and to another backup I had created years ago when my company still handled sensitive contracts. Another text arrived. He said this was family business and that taking it to outsiders would make me look like a fool. He said I was overreacting. He said this would all be easier if I just trusted him. I made another screenshot and sent it along with the first, then turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. The screen pulsed one more time, then stilled. I drove home along Buffalo Speedway with the radio off. The city slid past in blocks of heat, and light taco stands opening for the dinner crowd, a line of kids outside a snow cone truck, a woman pushing a stroller with a plastic fan clipped to the handle. At the light, I tapped the steering wheel and pulled up my notes app. I typed a new entry and listed times. Call from Carter. Meeting at branch. Password added. Holds applied. Texts from Ryan. Screenshots saved and forwarded. Case file number on sticky note in wallet. When I pulled into the driveway, the blinds were still half closed, the pose they had adopted since the funeral. I stepped inside and the house greeted me with a familiar hush. The dining table was bare again, the papers stacked neatly in the sideboard where I had shoved them before leaving. My chest loosened a fraction. In the kitchen, the answering machine light blinked twice, then stopped. I poured a glass of water and stood at the sink, letting the coolness slide through me. My phone vibrated once more on the counter. A single line from Ryan. He wrote that delays were childish and that he would take care of everything if I could not. I let the message sit on the screen without touching it until the display dimmed. Then I opened the camera roll and checked that the earlier screenshots had synced to the cloud. They had. I put the phone face down again and looked out the window toward the small patch of lawn I had mowed a day after the funeral, trying to impose order on something that refused to be ordered. The house felt steadier than it had that morning. Not safe. Not yet. But steadier. I gathered the sticky note, the bank incident summary, and my new list, and slid them into a folder I labeled with a date I would not forget. Then I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and listened to the quiet. Somewhere outside, a sprinkler clicked on a steady metronome marking the minutes. Inside, the air was still. I breathed in then out and let the rhythm settle. I dressed in a dark suit and packed a thin folder into my briefcase. Inside were the bank incident summary, the sticky note with the case number screenshots of Ryan's messages, and a list of times I had written in stiff block letters. I left early to avoid traffic and parked in a garage near the Harris County Civil Courts. I took a seat on a middle bench and set my briefcase at my feet. I recognized two drivers from Collins Freight and nodded. Linda arrived 10 minutes later on Ryan's arm, the two of them followed by a man in a navy suit who moved like he owned his schedule. The lawyer introduced himself to the clerk, Colton Keene counsel, for Linda Collins and for her son. Eleanor Price, appearing for the firm that had prepared and held the original will, stood and stated her name. She said the firm would present the will for admission and had proof of execution and notarization. Keene spoke for Linda and Ryan. He said his clients were eager to ensure that the decedent's wishes were honored and that the estate was protected. He said there were concerns about potential mismanagement by certain parties and that the court should consider interim measures. Judge Anderson asked if there were objections to admission upon proof. Keene said his clients did not object, but that they anticipated issues regarding competency to manage assets. Ryan leaned toward me just enough for his voice to carry. He called me an old, unemployed man and said I was not fit to handle $5 billion. Judge Anderson told counsel to remind their clients that the courtroom was not a place for commentary. I remembered my list of times and Carter's advice about documented facts. I kept my hands folded. Eleanor approached the lectern with the sealed envelope. She explained that the will had been executed in late April of the previous year, witnessed by two individuals whose affidavits were attached. Keene asked to speak on the record about concerns regarding my ability to act in any capacity. He said retirement and recent health issues raised practical questions. Judge Anderson asked if he was making a formal motion. Keene said he was reserving the right to move for temporary conservatorship should circumstances require. Eleanor replied that the court's task today was limited admission home, upon proof identification of the named executor and setting the next date for contested petitions. She said the firm stood ready to provide the executed documents for inspection and that the will spoke for itself. The judge asked the clerk to mark the envelope and open it. Eleanor read a verification from one of the witnesses. She said the original would remain with the court until certified copies were made. Keene asked the court to caution parties against unilateral banking changes. He said there had been an attempt by certain individuals to confuse the bank about authorized signers. Eleanor answered that any bank encounters would be resolved by reference to the letters testamentary once issued, and that until then unauthorized attempts were inappropriate, regardless of who made them. The judge agreed and told counsel to instruct their clients accordingly. Ryan muttered that stability required decisive leadership and that some people should know when to step aside. I thought of Margaret in her first truck making a run to San Antonio because a driver had called in sick. I thought of her saying that money was loud and character was quiet. I let the words drain from Ryan's mouth without catching on anything inside me. The judge set a short date, said the court would expect any petitions to be filed promptly, and encouraged everyone to let the process work. When he stood to leave the bench, the room exhaled. The bailiff announced that the matter was concluded for the day. Linda turned in her seat at last and looked at me. She said in a low voice that we should keep this dignified. Then she rose and placed her hand on Ryan's arm like the finale of a performance. Keene approached and handed Eleanor a business card. Eleanor told me in a low voice that certified copies would be ready within the week and that her office would contact me. I gathered my briefcase and stood. The drivers from Collins Freight waited by the door. Earl nodded and said that Margaret would have approved of quiet patience. His friend added that storms pass slower when you watch them and faster when you keep working. I told them both thank you and meant it. In the hallway, the light felt different, harsher against the polished floor. Linda and Ryan spoke with Keene 10 feet away, their heads angled toward one another, like a small huddle. Ryan glanced up when I passed, and his mouth curved in a smile. He said that some men look better seated, and that I should get used to the view. I kept walking. The elevator took its time. A young father in a wrinkled dress shirt stood beside me holding a toddler who was fascinated by the buttons. The father looked tired but relieved. The doors opened and the small group entered. When I stepped out onto the street, the heat wrapped around me all at once. I loosened my tie and let the air find my throat. I stood for a moment on the courthouse steps and looked out at the city. Buses sighed at the curb. A food truck sent up a ribbon of smoke. A woman in a navy dress hurried past, holding a stack of files to her chest. I descended slowly and turned toward the garage. My phone buzzed, but I did not reach for it. The folder in my briefcase pressed against my leg like a reminder. There would be more hearings. There would be documents and arguments. For now, there was only the feel of the sun on my face and the steady rhythm of my feet carrying me forward. By the next hearing, the courthouse corridors felt familiar, in the way a place becomes familiar when you do not want it to be. I arrived early with my folder under my arm and sat on the same middle bench. Linda and Ryan entered a few minutes later with their lawyer. When Judge Anderson took the bench, the room settled into that respectful hush that makes even breathing feel loud. The clerk called our case. Eleanor was there for the firm that held the original will. Keene stood and announced that he wished to address the court on matters bearing on the prudent administration of the estate. He said that recent discoveries raised concern about my ability to manage complex financial responsibilities. He said that while respect for the decedent required deference to her wishes, the court also had a duty to guard against error and waste. He laid the first document on the lectern and asked to approach. Judge Anderson adjusted his glasses. Keene said the first document showed a mortgage on my primary residence reported as delinquent by several months within the last year. He added that the outstanding amount exceeded $200,000, and that collection efforts had been initiated. Our mortgage had been paid off years before. I looked at the page from where I sat and saw my name in a block of text and a loan number I did not recognize. He said that a pattern of missed obligations would suggest an inability to track key liabilities. These were bank statements, he said, from an account in my name. He spoke of overdraft notices and returned payments and a short history of withdrawals that appeared to serve no clear purpose. The clerk passed copies to the bench. A murmur rose from the back rows. I felt attention slide away from me and toward Linda and Ryan like a chair tipping under someone else. Ryan kept his gaze on the judge, but the corner of his mouth lifted. Keene framed it carefully. He told the judge that in complex estates, a court might consider temporary measures to ensure continuity. He said this was not an accusation of bad faith. He said it was a realistic accommodation to a clear pattern of financial confusion. He suggested that the court caution against unilateral control of significant assets until proper support systems were in place. Judge Anderson set the papers down and studied me with a long, even look. He asked whether I wished to respond. I stood and felt my knees threaten to forget their job. I said that our mortgage had been satisfied and that I had the release document. I said that to my knowledge there was no debt of that size and no collection efforts. I said that those bank transactions did not match my records. The judge asked whether I had brought the release. I said I had not brought it because until 2 minutes ago I had not been told that my home was supposedly under a delinquent note. He nodded once and said that documentation would be helpful at the next setting. He asked about the bank statements. I said that my branch manager could confirm that alerts had been placed to prevent unauthorized changes and that I would subpoena records if necessary. I did not say that the last time my son used the word stability, he had threatened to take my bank access. I did not say that my wife had told me my place depended on my obedience. Those were facts of the heart, not yet facts for the record. Keene rose again. He said he did not wish to cast aspersions, but that his clients were concerned by the discrepancy between my recollection and the printed pages. He suggested that such discrepancies were common when individuals were overwhelmed. He said that his clients were prepared to assist. From the benches behind me, someone whispered that this would all be easier if the son stepped in. Another voice said that people of a certain age should not have to handle numbers alone. I remembered Carter advising me to write down exact words. Eleanor stood with the quiet weight of a hammer that has not yet swung. She said that disputes of fact belong to evidence, not to speculation. She reminded the court that today remained within the narrow lane of admission and preliminary administration. She asked that the exhibits be marked for identification and not for truth. Judge Anderson agreed. He wrote on the corner of the first page and slid it to one side. Keene asked permission to call a brief witness from a mortgage servicing company to explain standard collection practices. Eleanor objected for scope. The judge sustained the objection. He asked that the court set an earlier date than usual to address interim protections. He said that everyone would benefit from clarity. While they talked, my mind ran through drawers at home. Top right in the study desk. Blue folder marked by a paperclip. Release of lien from a bank whose name had changed twice. I pictured Margaret sitting with me in her kitchen, running a finger along a column of numbers and asking why something did not foot. The judge looked back at me. He asked whether I had counsel. I said that I had spoken with an attorney and expected to finalize representation by the end of the week. He told me to do so. He told all counsel to exchange records within 7 days and to provide the court with a list of exhibits they intended to rely on at the next hearing. He told the parties to refrain from statements designed to influence banking institutions, absent letters testamentary. Keene said, "Of course." Linda nodded. As the judge spoke, I could feel the room tilting. The opinions. People who had come in neutral were finding the path of least resistance. A bank statement on letterhead looks like truth until it does not. A mortgage ledger with numbers lined up in columns looks like weight until someone points to the seam where the page was spliced. I had not yet pointed. Judge Anderson set a status date for 2 weeks out. He reminded both sides that haste and error make easy companions. He asked if there was anything further for today. Keene shook his head, satisfied with the hint of momentum. The clerk called the next case, and the bailiff signaled that we were done. As people rose, the murmur returned low and assessing. A driver from the old days caught my eye and gave a small shrug that said he believed me, but knew the power of paper. Linda brushed by me without stopping. Ryan leaned close enough that only I could hear and said that this was exactly the kind of mess that happens when a man will not admit he needs help. He walked on. I stayed seated for a moment after the row had emptied. I watched the clerk stack the exhibits. I thought about walking straight to my truck and driving to the house to pull that blue folder and put it in a fireproof bag. I thought about calling Carter and asking him to print every authentic page he could find that had my name on it. When I finally stood, the room seemed brighter, as if the lights had been turned up while I was thinking. I gathered my folder and moved toward the aisle. In the hallway, I passed a wall of windows and saw the city spread in heat and glass. I felt like a man who had seen a counterfeit bill and did not yet have the right pen in his pocket. At the elevator, I pressed the button and waited. Voices drifted from a conference room where lawyers traded jokes that would not be funny to anyone else. The doors slid open and I stepped inside. As they closed, I pictured the blue folder again and the embossed seal catching light. The car descended with a soft shiver and I let my shoulders fall a fraction. There was work to do and time to do it, and between those two things, a space wide enough for resolve to grow. Daniel met me on the courthouse steps with a worn leather briefcase and the steady look of a man who knows where each piece fits before the board is even set. When the clerk called our case, Daniel rose and announced his appearance for me. Judge Anderson nodded for him to proceed within the bounds of the setting. He placed a certified release of lien on the lectern and stated that the mortgage on my home had been satisfied years ago and recorded with the county. He said that any document suggesting delinquency was inconsistent with the public record and would require authentication beyond a photocopy. Then Daniel asked permission to call a brief witness for the limited purpose of foundation. Carter Wilson stepped in. Daniel walked him through his position at Gulfstar Bank on Kirby. He explained that 2 individuals had presented a power of attorney, purportedly executed by me, and had requested immediate authority to transfer pending estate funds and add themselves as signers. He testified that he then called me directly and confirmed that I had authorized no one. It contained the follow-up email confirming the verbal password that now sat between me and any phone request. Keene rose for cross and tried to suggest that misunderstandings happen in grief. Carter repeated that his staff follows procedures to protect clients, especially when documentation is defective. Keene asked if it was possible that a valid power existed elsewhere. Carter said that valid powers are easy to verify because they resist the light. Daniel said that clarity helps families breathe. He asked the court to mark another document for identification, a notarized affidavit, executed by Margaret the previous year at the same time as the will. He said simply that it states her wish that her entire estate pass to me, and that any attempt to insert third-party control would undermine both her plan and her reasons for making it. She stated that the firm had supervised its execution, that the notary was in good standing, and that the document had been maintained in their secure file from the date of execution until delivery to the court. Daniel asked to call one final witness. Mark Collins entered. Daniel asked what Margaret said about trust. He said that their mother loved them both, but she did not confuse love with trust. He said she told him more than once that I was the only man in the family who had never asked her for anything that did not belong to him. He said she told him she planned to leave everything to me because she believed I would hold the line the way she had held it. He added that he did not stand to gain from that plan. He was there because it was true. Keene stood for cross and tried to suggest that Mark had old resentments. Mark said families have plenty of old furniture, and some of it is ugly, but this was not that. Keene asked if Margaret ever used the exact words, entire estate. Mark said she did, and then he gave the date and the occasion. He remembered because she made him put down his phone and look her in the eye when she said it. As Mark stepped down, I felt the room lean back toward level. It was not victory. It was gravity returning to a place it had left for a minute. Daniel gathered his points without raising his voice. He said that exhibits offered by the other side at the last setting had been copies of unknown origin. He said that today the court had public records and bank testimony and a contemporaneous affidavit that fit the executed will like joins in a well-built bench. He said that if there were to be questions about competency, they should be directed to those who had brought defective documents into a bank and pressed for urgency when asked for verification. He asked the court to caution all parties again against unilateral attempts to access funds and to set firm deadlines for exchange of authentic records. Keene rose with a thin smile and said that his clients wanted exactly what Daniel claimed to want: stability and order. He said families are complicated and that good intentions can arrive dressed as stubbornness. He asked the court to keep interim protections in place and to remember that wealth requires management, and management requires experience. He said the word experience and let it sit as if it belonged only to his table. Judge Anderson leaned back and took a breath that seemed to measure the room. He said that the will and its supporting affidavit would be accepted for identification at this stage, and that certified copies would be available for counsel by the end of the day. He said that any party who wished to rely on a document would need to bring the original or a certified copy or a witness who could authenticate it without guessing. He looked at Keene when he said, without guessing. He instructed everyone to refrain from bank interactions that exceeded ordinary maintenance until letters issued. He told Daniel to provide the mortgage release and related county records to the clerk within 48 hours. He set the next date and said the court would expect concise filings and fewer adjectives. For the first time, Keene did not have a ready answer. His pen paused over his pad, and Linda's posture lost a half-inch. Ryan stared at his hands as if they had changed shape. The look on his face was not anger yet. It was something closer to surprise that the stage lights could dim when he had not told them to. When the judge left the bench, the room exhaled that same human sound of a crowd being a crowd again. Eleanor gave Daniel a small nod that looked like respect. Mark put a hand on my shoulder as we stepped into the aisle and said that his mother had always preferred clean lines. He said I had done fine. I told him thank you and meant it. In the hallway, Linda approached with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She told me that I was making this harder than it needed to be. She said this would all sort itself out if I stopped being afraid of help. Ryan stood beside her and avoided my gaze. Keane checked his phone as if it had solutions in its glass. Daniel stepped slightly between us without making it a scene and said that any future communications should be through counsel. Linda's smile faded at the edges. We rode the elevator down in silence with a handful of strangers who had their own stories stacked inside manila folders. On the street, the heat felt honest. Daniel asked if I could bring the mortgage release to his office by morning, and I told him yes. He said he would send a letter to the bank memorializing Carter's testimony and asking for certified records to match the affidavit. He said this is what momentum looks like before anyone calls it that. I watched Linda and Ryan climb into their car across the street. For a second, Ryan looked back at me as if trying to place where the pivot had happened. I felt no triumph, only a steadiness I had not known in months. Daniel shook my hand with that firm, measured grip of his and told me to eat something that was not coffee. I promised I would. Then I stood on the sidewalk and let the traffic wash past the papers in my briefcase, no longer a weight, but a spine that held my shape. Daniel scheduled the next hearing for late morning and asked me to meet him early outside the courtroom. He carried the same worn briefcase and a small padded case that looked like it might hold a tablet. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Anderson took the bench. Daniel rose and stated he would be offering authenticated material that bore directly on the decedent's intent and capacity. Keane stood and said he would object if this became theater. Judge Anderson said he would allow a narrow presentation if foundation was laid. Eleanor stepped forward to state for the record that the firm arranged the recording, that the notary and a staff witness had been present, and that the file had been maintained unchanged in their custody. Daniel said with the court's permission, the recording would play. The room shifted into a deeper quiet, the kind that makes the scrape of a shoe sound like a shout. She wore a pale cardigan and the same string of small pearls she favored when she wanted to look like a grandmother who also read contracts. Margaret answered with her full name and birth date and said she was making a statement to sit beside her will so that anyone who needed to understand her reasons would not have to guess. She said she had not been coerced, that she knew the nature of her assets, and that she was speaking of her own free will. She said that love and trust were not the same thing, and that her life had taught her to sort them carefully. She said she loved her daughter and her grandson, and always would, but that neither had shown the kind of stewardship that turns money into something more than noise. She said Linda liked the shine of wealth more than its work. She said Linda was generous when it helped her standing, and forgetful when the kindness asked for quiet. She said Ryan had confused ambition with entitlement, and that he had told her lies dressed as optimism. She said David was the only man in this family who made her feel at ease. She said I had never asked her for $1 that was not mine, and that I had a habit of doing useful things when no one was watching. She said that when she imagined her work being held in steady hands after she was gone, she saw my hands. She said her estate would pass to me, not to be managed by committees of relatives, not to be sliced into favors. She asked that any attempt to insert trustees from within the family be rejected as evidence that the attempt itself was why she chose me. She said anyone who argued that I was not competent was making her point for her. Years ago, after a storm had knocked out power on her street, I had shown up with a cooler of ice and a bundle of extension cords. She finished by stating again that she was sound of mind and that she reaffirmed the will executed that same week. No one spoke. I heard a soft sound behind me, a small breath caught and released, and turned enough to see Earl from the freight yard rub the back of one hand across his eyes. Eleanor stood very still, her gaze fixed on the judge. Daniel asked that the recording be marked and preserved as part of the court file. Judge Anderson said yes. He said the words in the video would be weighed alongside the executed will and the other evidence. Keene rose slowly. He said he would not challenge the authenticity of the recording at this time, but that words spoken in a kitchen did not substitute for proper administration of complex assets. It was like listening to a man insist a storm was still overhead when all anyone could hear was dripping from the eaves. Daniel kept his reply short. He said the court now had a clear statement of intent from the decedent, made while sound of mind, delivered under oath, and consistent with the instrument already before the court. He said any interim measures should honor motive as well as mechanism. I sat with my hands folded and felt something give way inside my chest, not a breaking, more like a knot loosening after years of being cinched. Heat rose behind my eyes before I could stop it. I tipped my head toward my lap and let it come. I had not cried in front of Linda in decades. I had not cried in front of anyone but a nurse the night a doctor said the word stent. Now a tear fell to the back of my hand and left a clean track across the dry skin. I did not wipe it. I did not hide it. The sound in the room shifted, a softer current moving among the benches. It was not pity. It was recognition, that rare thing. Judge Anderson studied the screen for another long moment, then told the clerk to secure the file and maintain the chain of custody. He reminded counsel to prepare their exhibits in certified form for the next date. He said that families often come in with storms of words, and that the job of the court is to find the shape that does not blow away. He asked if there was anything further required at this time. No one had anything worth saying. As people stood, the usual scrape of shoes returned lower and slower. A woman I did not know touched my sleeve as she passed and nodded once. Mark moved to my side and pressed a folded tissue into my palm without looking at me. Linda brushed by, the scent of her perfume bright and brittle. She kept her head high. Ryan stared at the floor, as if the tile might offer instructions. Daniel packed the tablet and slipped the cable back into its case. He asked if I was all right. I told him I felt like I had been holding my breath for a year and just remembered how to exhale. He smiled without showing teeth and said that sometimes the simplest truths need a screen to be heard. Eleanor stepped over and said her office would deliver certified copies by afternoon, and that the notary was available if the court wanted live testimony later. We filed into the hallway, and the fluorescent lights seemed a little kinder. Through the tall windows, the city went on as always, buses sighing, a courier jogging across the crosswalk, a cloud letting go of a thin rain that never reached the ground. I pressed the tissue to the back of my hand, where the tear had dried. It left a soft smear that disappeared as I rubbed. Daniel said he would call with the next steps after he spoke with the clerk. I thanked him and felt the words settle into place like a stone that finally found its bed. For a few seconds, I stood there with the door swinging shut behind me and listened to the hush that follows a truth spoken plainly. It did not erase the fight ahead. It did not fix decades of being made small. It did something quieter and stronger. It reminded me that I had been seen. And once you are seen that way, the rest of the path does not look the same. Judge Anderson said the court had reviewed the will, the affidavit that accompanied it, the foundation testimony from the notary, and the firm the bank manager's record regarding attempted access and the statements of witness. He said that on this record, the instrument would be admitted, the affidavit accepted as probative of intent, the bank testimony credited as evidence of protective steps taken in good faith. He said the petition that had hinted at conservatorship had no footing and would be denied if filed in its present form. He looked to the clerk and instructed her to prepare letters testamentary and certified copies for release that afternoon. He reminded counsel that any future filings were to be concise and tethered to evidence rather than to speculation. He said the court saw no basis for interim control by parties other than the one named. He finished with a calm caution against further attempts to influence financial institutions outside the process. I told her in a low voice that we would follow the order. I said that unity without respect was theater, and that I would not walk back into a role where my worth depended on my silence. Ryan pointed at me with a small tremor in his finger and said I would regret this, that I was a failure who did not understand the weight he had just taken on. He looked at me and said the path ahead would be administrative and that the court trusted I would retain competent advisors. Outside, a reporter called my name from behind a microphone and asked how it felt to inherit a fortune. Another asked if the family was united. One asked whether I planned to sell Collins Freight or rebuild. At the curb, Daniel checked his watch and said we would pick up certified copies at 2 and that he would courier the letters to the bank by 3. He said Robert was on standby to begin the inventory list and that Eleanor's office would coordinate county filings. He asked if I could come by his office after lunch to sign authorizations. She said we were family and that money should not divide what love had built. I told her that love without truth is a mask and that I was done playing roles. Inside the clerk's office, a printer hummed and thin blue security paper slid into a stack. She stamped a seal with practiced pressure and slid the documents across the counter one by one. Letters testamentary, certified copies of the will. The affidavit staples aligned just so. I signed a receipt and tucked them into my briefcase the way a mason sets the first true brick careful and square. Daniel thanked the clerk by name. Eleanor nodded once to me and said her office would transmit digital copies to the bank and to our emails before end of day. On the sidewalk again, my phone began to vibrate with messages I ignored. An old friend from my freight days sent a short line that said, "Proud of you." A neighbor asked if the headlines were real. The local station posted a clip and a headline that hung on the number. I let it all pass. Numbers can fill a screen. They cannot hold a life. We walked to a small diner a block away because Daniel insisted that legal victories without food are bad luck. He ordered a turkey sandwich and coffee and made me do the same. He went over next steps in a quiet voice. Inventory and appraisals, notices to creditors, insurance policy reviews, a clean map drawn in boxes on a pad. He reminded me to stay as careful with my words as I had been with my paperwork. I said I would. He slid a business card across the table for a security consultant. He trusted someone who sets up household procedures when public attention arrives uninvited. When we stepped back into the heat, the day had taken on that bright edge Houston gets when storms sit out in the Gulf and the air is waiting. Near the corner, Mark emerged from the shade of a pillar and fell into step. He said his mother would have liked the way I kept my voice level. He said Linda had asked him to convince me to be generous. He said he told her generosity is not a word you get to use after you lay traps. I put a hand on his shoulder and left it there a moment. As we reached the car, a text arrived from an unknown number, a link to a local site that had posted a quick piece with a photo of me from a holiday party years ago. The caption named me as heir and described me as a retired logistics engineer. The comments were already at war with themselves. I closed the window and slid the phone into my pocket. Back at Daniel's office, we signed what needed signing. He copied the letters and placed one on top of a packet labeled for the bank. He said he would walk it to a courier himself. He reminded me again that boundaries matter most in the first 48 hours. I told him I would not be taking calls I did not need to take. He said, "Good." He said, "Do not argue with anyone who is performing for an audience you did not invite." Evening settled by degrees as I drove home along the loop. The sky to the west went the color of steel. My hands felt steady on the wheel. I parked in the driveway and sat with the engine off. The house was quiet behind the blinds. I carried the briefcase inside and set it on the kitchen table. I opened it and took out the letters and placed them to the left. I set the certified copies to the right. I stood there for a long moment, palms flat on the wood, and let the weight of paper transform into what it really was, not a fortune, not a weapon, but a trust. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Linda appeared in the doorway, eyes red, voice soft. She asked me again to share, said we could present a united front, said we could avoid embarrassment. I told her that unity would begin with honesty, and that she had a long road to walk before we spoke that language together. For a moment she looked smaller than I remembered. Then she straightened, collected herself, and left the room without another word. In the still that followed, I heard a single car pass on the street, and the faint buzz of my phone on the counter as another alert went out into a city that loves a headline. I turned the screen face down and breathed in the quiet of my own kitchen. The day had given me something I had not felt in years. Not victory, not revenge, authority without noise. I gathered the documents and carried them to the study where the blue folder waited, and placed them beside it with the care you give to a promise you plan to keep. I began to hear about doors closing that had always opened for Linda. On Tuesday morning, a reporter I did not know left a voicemail asking for comment on a civil complaint filed in Harris County by 2 early investors in his startup. That night, the front door stayed closed, the lights dim. In the quiet, I opened Margaret's ledgers again and found the note she had written beside an entry for December of a year-long gone pay driver, early for Christmas, remind warehouse to replace tire. The neatness of her hand steadied me. I thought of what to do next that would feel like honoring rather than winning. I called the treasurer at the food bank and asked how to set up a gift in Margaret's name, with no announcement, just shelves stocked through winter. The treasurer paused, then said yes, then said thank you, then said nothing else because sometimes thanks is good work. The next morning the doorbell rang, and I let Daniel's security consultant walk through the routines of a more public life. He installed a smart doorbell that recorded without being nosy and set up separate email addresses and another phone line that could filter calls before they reached me. He talked about best practices for home deliveries and for unannounced visitors who carry clipboards and look official. He was kind without being sentimental. He left me with a list on one sheet of paper. I liked that. Over the weekend, a friend of Linda's tried to hold a small gathering to show support, but only 2 people came and 1 left early. On Monday, she texted to say our house had become uncomfortable and that she would stay with a friend for a while. I did not argue. A friend can be a mirror that only shows one side. Ryan sent a message through his attorney asking to retrieve equipment from a storage space under my name. Daniel replied that access could be arranged with inventory and signatures. The attorney agreed. I walked the space with a clipboard and a lockbox key. Ryan arrived late with a stiff posture and a face set toward future schedules that no longer existed. He did not look at me. I watched him stack monitors and cables into a friend's pickup, the coil of a network cord trailing in the dust, like a snake that had forgotten its shape. Before he drove off, he turned as if to say something. He did not. The truck rattled away. On Wednesday, I went to St. Thomas for the first time since the video had played. I chose a seat near the aisle because my knees liked the extra room. The light through the stained glass cut the air into soft pieces. People drifted in slowly, a few to pray, a few to look at the memorial plaque the church had placed in the side hall for Margaret. I thought I might slip in and slip out without meeting many eyes. I was wrong. When I stepped into the nave, a lay leader near the back turned and saw me. He raised a hand, then another. People began to stand. It started like a ripple and then became something larger, the whole room rising. There was a soft sound as feet found the floor. Someone in the front began to clap once, twice, unsure, and then the sound gathered until it filled the space. I felt my face heat and my throat tighten. The applause did not feel like spectacle. It felt like a welcome home to a place I had never claimed. I put a hand to my chest and nodded. I did not speak. I did not need to. The noise rolled over me like a wind that cleans rather than knocks down. When it faded, the room settled into a quiet that made the next breath easy. After the service, a group gathered in the parish hall for coffee. Earl and two other drivers from the old days sat at a table with paper cups, laughing quietly about a night run near Laredo when a clutch cable snapped and a fix had to be rigged with wire and prayer. The minister shook my hand and said he was glad to see me in the pews. He did not mention the case or the number or the news. He asked if I might talk to the youth group someday about what work looks like when no one is clapping. I said I would. On the way out, a woman I did not know pressed a folded note into my palm. She said her husband had been on a crew that unloaded Collins freight at night, that Margaret had once stood with them in the rain to make sure a shipment of medical supplies got into the right van, that she had not forgotten that kind of leadership, that she was glad the estate would be held by someone who had known that version of her. The note said only, "Thank you for standing steady." I put it in my wallet beside the sticky note with the bank case number. Both felt like tools reminders to measure twice before cutting. By the end of the week, rumors that had fed on shadows began to starve. Linda's circle thinned to the few who are loyal more to friendship than to weather. Ryan's suit expanded as more investors joined their names, adding lines to a caption beneath a courthouse photo. I stayed busy with Daniel and Robert, with appraisals and checklists, and the kind of order that makes space for sleep. Each task felt like a rung on a ladder, leading out of a hole I had pretended for years was simply my home. One evening I stood on the back porch with a glass of water and listened to the crickets and the faint rush of the freeway half a mile away. The heat had slipped a little, and a small wind moved the leaves in the oak. In the kitchen, the blue folder lay open beside the new stack of certified papers, the edges squared. I thought of Margaret counting things out loud so her math would sit straight. I thought of Linda somewhere across town, and Ryan in a rented office packing boxes he had expected someone else to carry. I did not feel triumph. I felt a grief that had finally put down its heavy suitcase and sat quietly beside me. The night did what nights do, wrapped the yard in a darkness that did not feel like threat, and I watched it settle, hands resting easy on the rail, ready to lead the day that would come next. I closed on a small brick house at the edge of Sugarland, where the streets curl softly around live oaks and the church bells from St. Thomas reach you if the wind is right. The place was modest and bright, a narrow porch, a tidy yard, a kitchen that smelled like sunlight when the blinds were up. The realtor kept waiting for me to ask about something bigger. I told her I wanted quiet. She nodded and handed me the keys with a smile that felt like relief. Moving day did not require a truck the size of my old life. I kept the dining table that had seen so much paper and not enough conversation. I let the old house go to a buyer who said she loved the light in the front room. I walked the rooms one last time and left my set of keys on the counter. The silence there had always asked something of me that I could not afford. I woke before the sun and brewed coffee that tasted like a promise. I walked the loop around the park and let my feet find a steady rhythm. At the food bank, I carried boxes and checked expiration dates and learned the names of the volunteers who had been doing this work long before my name started making news crawls. At church, I sat 3 pews back and let the music rest in the space behind my ribs. The minister never mentioned numbers. He asked only what I could carry. The estate settled into the channels Margaret had cut for it, clean and direct. Daniel and Robert moved through checklists and filings with the calm of men who fix things that are meant to last. We set up a fund in Margaret's name for scholarships to community college and for keeping the food bank shelves full through winter. I learned that quietly solving small problems is a better anthem than any speech I could give. From time to time, news of Linda floated to me on the breeze people call concern. Her circle had shrunk to a few names that were not afraid of an empty chair next to theirs. She had taken a new place to live near a friend who still liked Thursdays at the salon. Once she texted to say she hoped I was happy and that she missed the way things used to be. I stared at the words a long moment and put the phone face down without answering. You can love a memory without wanting to move back in with it. Ryan's headlines settled into court dates and filings and then into the quieter grind of accountability. I saw him once across a courthouse corridor carrying a banker box. He did not see me. I felt no pull to speak. I wished him a clear horizon in my head and kept walking. On Sundays after service, I had coffee in the parish hall. Earl stopped by now and then and asked if I remembered the winter the clutch cable snapped near San Antonio. We would laugh and disagree about which wire we used to fix it long enough to get home. The room felt like a porch where strangers become neighbors, and neighbors make room for your chair without asking why you arrived alone. One afternoon, I opened the blue folder on my kitchen table and lined up the documents. The affidavit with Margaret's steady gaze caught mid-frame on a still. I ran a thumb along the edges, then filed them in a drawer with a new label that made sense only to me. The ledgers went on a shelf in the study next to a faded photograph of a younger version of her standing on a loading dock, in a jacket 2 sizes too big, hair pulled back, smile fierce enough to light a warehouse. I had been humiliated in a courtroom not so many months ago. My son had called me names that tasted like iron. My wife had asked the judge to measure my worth with a yardstick made of speculation. And then there was Margaret, the only person in the room who knew how to point a camera at the truth. She saw me fully and acted accordingly. She did not save me from work. She gave me work worthy of the man she had known. That is a different kind of mercy. I carried her sentence with me through the day. Love and trust are not the same thing. Learn to sort them carefully. In the evenings, I sat on the back steps with a glass of water and watched the last light slip down the fence boards. The neighborhood kids rode bikes in loops and drew chalk galaxies that survived until the sprinklers woke. In those quiet hours, I understood something I had only guessed at when this began. Revenge is not money changing hands. Revenge is a life returned to its rightful size. It is waking up and not needing permission to value your own breath. It is building a day that does not require the approval of people who taught you to doubt yourself. I kept my old pickup because its seat remembers me. I planted herbs outside the kitchen window and burned a pot of beans before I learned the new stove. I bought a second-hand desk and polished it until the wood showed a calm face. I walked past the church office one afternoon and saw my name on a sign-up sheet for a project I do not remember writing down. I left it there. There were awkward moments. A man at the hardware store recognized me and asked what it was like to be rich. I told him I was working on being honest and useful, and that it was surprisingly time-consuming. He laughed and said that sounded about right. A woman at the grocery asked if it was true that I had let my family fall apart for the sake of pride. I said a marriage falls apart long before the headlines, and that pride is not the same as dignity. She frowned as if the words were a puzzle, and then nodded slowly. The best mornings were the plain ones. The small cheer from a kid who learned to ride without training wheels. The quiet click of my front door as I came home with a bag of groceries and a mind not crowded by someone else's urgency. I could feel my days acquiring weight in a way that made sleep easier. I still visit the freight yard sometimes. The new trucks are quieter than the old beasts. The men and women who run them are the same kind of steady. I stand near the dock and let the smell of diesel and hot rubber work its way into the folds of my jacket. It is a perfume that reminds me of the person I have always been. Just quieter than the noise that used to call itself love. When people ask me what it feels like to inherit an empire, I tell them that empires make poor companions unless you teach them to whisper. I tell them that Margaret did not hand me a crown. She handed me a ledger and said, "Keep the numbers honest and the people fed." I can do that. It is the only kind of power that lets a man sleep. Now and then I drive past the old house and do not turn my head. It belongs to its new life. I belong to mine. If the light is right, I see my reflection faint in the glass of the kitchen window as I wash a plate and set it on a drying rack and listen to the quiet shift in the room like a cat settling into a warm spot. Peace is not loud. It is a steady thing that arrives when you stop auditioning for the people who do not know how to cast you.